Thank you very much, Sean. Happy Wednesday, everyone. Thank you again for attending another session of RM Smart Investing. Um, Today's topic, I hope it's timely. And I hope it goes beyond the scope of just a title. Here, we're gonna speak about gold and dollar, but hopefully by end of our session, you will have a better understanding of not only just the relationship of gold and dollar and how they behave, but also understanding more about the geopolitical and geoeconomics of the world. And beyond that, also, hopefully, you will have a more clear vision and picture about, for instance, the cryptocurrencies, the digital currencies, and maybe have a little more appreciation of that. So, what we're going to do basically in the next hopefully 45 minutes or so, first we're going to start with this thing called money. What is money? And then why gold has been the standard of, of representative of money. And beyond that, we will discuss something called the gold standard and what does that mean? Is it applicable in today's environment? And then we will have a short journey through time. So we'll start talking about the events which have affected the dollar and gold in few slides. So hopefully it's condensed, but gives you a much better and clear understanding again. And within that subject, I cannot talk about dollar without discussing the Bretton Woods Agreement, which is important to again understand the events that uh, took us to where we are today. And then we will discuss briefly about petrodollars, and then just briefly about the events that happened in Europe after the financial crisis, 2010, 2011, and basically initially it was called PEGS, but I call it GIPS. Basically, there's more of in the portfolio management uh, when we talk about GIPS is the Global Investments Performance Standards. So we kind of change it from PEGS. And then uh, I do have with our slides, is about 9 or 10 page slides. It was done on a PDF format. It's an actual history of gold, and I think you will find it very informative. I would not go over it. You can study it on your own, but I think it's a really nice reference of what has happened from the beginning with the actual creation of gold and all the stages that we've gone through. So with that in mind, let's start with this quote from Aristotle. And he said that money was intended to be used in exchange, but not to increase that interest. So in his opinion, interest is really not a legitimate purpose of having money. Money is for the exchange, and that's what it is. So it's saying that the money is giving birth by using interest. It's like its offspring, and it's not very comfortable with that. But the quote that I really love and also his understanding is what is the meaning of currency? When we talk about money, what are the things that it's important to define the role of the money? So, and I think after all these years, still it applies what Aristotle he had implied. So, in his opinion, money should be durable. That means it has to stand the test of time and the elements. That cannot fade, it cannot corrode, it cannot change or change through the time. It also has to be portable. Money must be able to hold a high amount of worth relative to its size and weight. And it has to be divisible, which is easy to separate and combine without affecting its fundamental characteristics. And it has to be scarce. Any good money would have intrinsic value, which is this is important. And that's what I mentioned. It's to understand the world that we're living right now. So it has to have that intrinsic value and without ties to any other object to support its worth. So, and I think this gives you a better picture of when we talk about different currencies and talk about gold. So this was his opinion then, and I think still applies today. I think this picture tells us, as they say, the picture is worth 1,000 words. This is done by Dr. Siegel, which he looked at the value of different asset classes from 1802 to 2018. And as you can see, when we look at the dollar, because of the inflation, $1 in 1802 would be worth 1 penny. So the dollar not only doesn't appreciate, but it actually depreciated 99%. On the other hand, when we look at gold, it's worth almost exact same thing. So that's the reason when we think about gold, its main job is a store of value. And that's the reason we talk about in an inflationary period, it holds its value. But gold is not an investment. It's not in a long term. As you can see, this is in over 216 years, it has not really increased. So, but it has kept its value. You go back 5,000 years ago, 4,000, the gold still almost the same value. And that's the reason gold is still popular to this day. Then we look at the treasury bills and we look at bonds, and of course, you look at what the stock market has done. And that's the reason stock market equities have become so popular in the long run, and because of the valuation like that. So that's the reason, again, we're discussing more about gold and dollar now to see why that it is important to understand that the intrinsic value. So why gold? I think of all the precious metals, when you go to Olympics or any type of a sports activity, you get a gold medal as #1. When you get a credit card, top one is there's platinum, but it's like a gold card. Then when you talk about businesses or any type of events or universities, educational institutions, they call them the gold standard. So the gold has been really regarded as the highest standard available. And because of that, it is valued so highly because it is when we look at the history, when we look at different cultures, when we look at different demographics, it has the same attitude towards it. That's why it has kept its value. Now, let me give you some facts about gold, so hopefully it helps you to understand a little more about where it comes from. Number one, gold is usually dominated in dollar, and we will discuss it why. And this is an interesting fact. There is no really set relationship between gold and dollar, although most of the time when we look at when the dollar is down, gold is up as a commodity. When the gold is down, the dollar is up. So basically, there is that relationship, but it's not a set relationship. There are times that the gold can go up with the dollar, and there are times that both can go down. And we will discuss some historical events that has happened. Now, the other thing is over 90 to 95% of the world, they have to translate the value of the gold to their own currency. Even though it's valued in dollar, you have to exchange it. So that's another thing you have to understand, and that's where the valuation comes. In the times of crisis, when there's a geopolitical turmoils and there's a fear, gold does rise as the faith in the governments fall. And what happens is people are looking for security, the sanctuary, and that's where the gold becomes the place to be. By the way, today's our class, our presentation, I'm gonna basically talk about the facts about gold. It's not gonna be about investment ideas. We've had classes on gold as a commodity, how to invest in gold. We've talked a dollar about in our Forex class, foreign exchange class, on the currencies. So my whole objective is, again, the relationship between these two asset classes, and also, again, understanding more about how the history can teach us what is happening and what will happen in the future. We'll have hopefully better understanding. So what factors do affect the gold? So the interest rates, for instance, and it's very interesting. We are in an environment that a lot of these factors actually apply. So interest rates, this environment with the monetary policies, what is happening now, because gold does not pay any interest, and it's not an interest-bearing investment. Obviously, when interest rate starts going up, that the money actually chooses to go to alternative investments rather than gold because they can get higher yield. And that's why it's important to understand the effects of interest rates. Inflation, as we discussed, that store of values in a higher inflationary environment, when there is a fear, investors or public decides to go a place that it can asset that can hold its value, and that's what gold is. In the monetary policy, which chooses to control the interest rates and the increase or decrease of the margins, or in as far as now that environment we are with all this money flooding the markets, basically that also affects the gold. And the last but not least, gold is in a commodity, so the supply and demand, the interruption in supplies or reduction in demands or increase in demands, they all affect the price of gold. So some of the advantages of gold is gold, as like Aristotle we just mentioned, has an intrinsic value, so that's what is valuable. It also provides a self-regulating and stabilizing effect on the economy, again, because it has that value. And it does reward the productive nations, so they don't depend on large debts. Like, for instance, when we have inflationary environment and debts, gold becomes that standard to reduce the effects of that. So, and that's the reason that brings me to something called gold standard. So we've had the gold standards, a lot of countries, nations have had. And what is this thing called gold standard? Basically, it's a system which a currency is backed by the gold reserves. So you have to back it up, your whatever currency that you have, whatever you're printing, you have to have enough gold to provide for that amount of whatever the money has been printed. So each unit of currency is worth a specific weight of gold. So for the longest time, Switzerland was the place of was really the insurance currency that was called, because it was backed. But we will discuss to see where we stand in today's world. So basically, you can see balancing act. If this much gold, you have to have, that's how much money you can print. So the pros about having the gold standard is obviously you have price stability, because what it is, it's difficult for the governments to go and just inflate the prices, because you have to back it up with the assets that you have. And also it brings stability in a sense that because of the fixed international exchange rates between the nations, it reduces the uncertainty. Now, the cons and the reason we have gotten away from that is that, number one, a lot of countries do not produce gold, and it also could limit the economic growth because of that, again, the stability and stability of the movement. And also in times of recession, because now it becomes a double-edged sword, it kind of prolongs the recession. So what happens because of that, it limits the central banks, which is what we are doing now, to do what they have to do by now. They, as you can see, in the times of crisis, they've been printing money. For some of you, you've seen two of them in the past 11 years. You can see how that central banks can get very proactive. And that's the reason, the gold standard does not apply at today's world. And that's the reason now you can have a better understanding of why there's alternative currencies in the picture. At the end of the session, as I mentioned, you can see, based on the history, why there is almost rebellion in a sense. That's what I call, when we talk about alternative currencies. So it was really the next 4 slides. This was really nicely capsuled history of gold. It was done by Kimberly Amadeo, so I thought to share with you. I didn't want to deviate what she had done. I kind of summarized it, so picked the ones that they were applicable. But I thought it's very timely and very interesting. So basically, the earliest known use of gold as a currency was in 600 BC in Lydia, and which is Turkey, in the present-day Turkey. In 1861, the first US paper currency was printed. And then in 1900, we had the Gold Standard Act of 1900, which actually established gold as the only metal for redeeming paper. So it became paper currency. So that's what, we've had the silver in the past, but the gold became the one. And it guaranteed that the government would redeem any amount of paper money for its value in gold. So here is a relationship, and that's the birth of like a gold standard. But then 1913 comes. We had a discussion a couple of weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, about central banks and Fed. And here it was the birth of that, the Federal Reserve. It comes to the picture, it stabilizes gold and currency values in the US. And then what happens? We have the World War I in 1914. And now what happens is the US and European countries, they actually suspended the gold standard so they could actually print enough money to pay for their military involvements and all the other expenses. So here's the beginning of kind of a moving away from gold. And then after the war, countries realized, hey, they didn't need to tie their currency to gold, so why should they? So they started leaving that gold standard by 1930s. So what happens now? We have 1929 stock market crash, and then the Great Depression hit. So investors who started trading in currencies and commodities, and because of that, the price of gold started rising. So people started changing their dollars and for the hope of having stable currency in a sense for gold. And then it worsens because remember, we had all these bank failings. So what happened is people started hoarding the gold because they didn't want to, basically had the bank runs and they didn't trust the financial institutions. Because of all that pressure, a lot of bank failings. So on March of 6th, 1933, the President Roosevelt, he actually closed the banks. That was called bank holiday, by the way, in response to a run on gold reserves at the Federal Reserve. And by the time banks reopened, which was a week later on March 13, the banks had turned all their gold to the Federal Reserve, and they could no longer redeem dollars for gold, and no one could export gold. So this is an important date, and it's an important situation that you have to understand that on April 20th, 1933, FDR ordered Americans to turn in their gold in exchange for the dollars. And this is an important date because you can see the power of the government. They did that because they want to prohibit the hoarding of the gold, and they wanted to redeem the gold. They put a fixed price, I think it was $32 to $35, and but this way they had the fixed price for the other countries, and that's when the gold became the reserves in the Fort Knox. They would move there, and because of that, the U.S. became the largest supply of gold. Now, the reason I share this because I want to think about how all of a sudden the government has that power to do that, and it just brings me to this alternative currencies and cryptocurrencies, and brings me to Bitcoin. Now, enacted on January 13, 1934, we had the Gold Reserve Act, which prohibited the private ownership of gold except under license. So it allowed the government to pay its debt in dollars, not gold. So gave them that freedom. Let me share a little story. In 1980s, I started collecting gold coins. I was investing in gold and silver, and I remember there would be like, these, there was a lot of uh, not very reputable gold coin from Long Island, especially, Alphas would call and they would say, oh, we have the 1933 St. Gaudens, or we had like a double eagle. And, basically everything was melted down. I think there was only 13 double eagle gold coins had survived, and there's only 2 left now. So when they were saying that, that's what there's education right now. So if somebody calls you, say, oh, we have a 1933 or 1934 and 35, well, there were no gold coins at that time. They did have Swiss, for instance, Swiss coins and other things, but not American, say Liberty or St. Gaudens, basically eagle. So anyway, so because the US held a majority of the world's gold, most countries pay the value of their currency to the dollar instead of gold. So here's the birth of the dollar, in a sense, as being the currency of choice, in a sense. Now, in 1960, the US actually held $19.4 billion in gold reserves, including $1.6 billion in International Monetary Fund, which is the IMF, which we will discuss it when we talk about Bretton Woods. And that was enough to cover the 18.7 billion in foreign dollars outstanding. So what happened, because of the large oil reserves that Soviet Union had, they became a big producer. And because they're accumulating US dollars in its foreign reserve, and because everything, remember that the dollars were the currency of the petroleum or oil, the Soviet Union deposited its dollar reserves in European banks, and here that idea became the euro dollars. That's where the euro dollars come into existence. Now, by the 1970s, the United States stockpile of gold had declined for 3 reasons, which we'll discuss again. Now, we had the double-digit inflation, which reduced the euro dollar's value, and more banks, they actually started redeeming their holdings for gold. So what happened, the US could no longer meet their obligations. So here we go, the dollar-gold relationship was changed to $38 per ounce during the Nixon administration. So a lot of things happened during Nixon administration. So the Fed could no longer redeem dollars with gold, which made the gold standard meaningless. Now, I'll go a step ahead. In 1971, Nixon decided that they are gonna move on from the gold standards, and that's where the free float started happening, which we'll discuss a little further down the road. Once the gold standard was dropped, now the countries could begin, they could begin printing more of their own currencies, which resulted in inflation, but also more economic growth because they had more control. And then, although these are, there are some people, they advocate for the return to the gold standard. I've even heard, I know in the 1990s, there was a discussion actually used like a real estate as a reserve, for instance. But it is, with what's going on, I think it doesn't look likely. And they feel that, economists feel that with the gold standards, although it's necessary during its time, no longer applicable in the modern world economy. So discussing the gold standards, the dollar. So let's discuss what is this thing called Bretton Woods Agreement. Now, Bretton Woods Agreement happened in the summer of 1944, before the actually end of the World War II. And it was in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, and about 44 delegates from 44 countries, they got together and they want to think about post-war, what's going to happen. So what they decided to replace the gold standards with the US dollar as the global currency. The US was the most stable economy in the world. So by doing this, they really gave America that dominant power in the world economy. So I want to pause here. And that's the reason I mentioned hopefully you can see things a little more clearly. Granted, the US had the power, but you can see sometimes these resentments from the developing countries or some other Western and the uh, Western European countries or Eastern European countries, or when we go to Asia, for instance. So some of the reasons was because really now the dollar became the dominant power. And what happened was that America, because it was the only country, had the right now, because they became the global currency, they could print dollars after this agreement. So what happened because of that, then they created the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. One was monitoring the world currency, the other one was helping the developing countries, for instance, as by giving loans and helping financial aid. So now it is, again, this was done by United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. That was done in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. So what happened in the 1970s, the effectiveness of this Bretton Woods kind of fade away, because President Nixon came and said, we no longer exchange the gold for US currencies. Now, next slide, you shall see the relationship between the gold, US dollar, and other currencies. So now the member countries, they were obliged to maintain fixed exchange rates between their currency and the dollar under this agreement. So the bank would buy up the current country's currency in a foreign exchange market if its currency value became too weak and relative to the dollar. Now, one thing they agreed that they wanted to avoid the trade wars, because it was agreed by members of the Bretton Woods system, and they could not, they could regulate their currencies under certain conditions, but they wouldn't lower their currency strictly to increase trade. So what is happening today? I mean, that's what we call this trade war, manipulating the currencies and other things. So I hope now it makes more sense why there's this fight. So now, again, what happened was, as I mentioned, that fixed exchange rate was broken. The gold standard was buckled by President Nixon. So actually, the London gold market was shut for 2 weeks. In 1971, for instance, the supply was inadequate to cover dollars in circulation. So, and that's when the President Nixon declared a temporary halt on the dollar's convertibility in gold for the central banks. And by 1973, many countries started floating against each other and against the US dollar, which led to the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. Now, after the downfall, so this is what happened with the options. The currency was allowed to float freely, and the pegging currencies to another group of currencies, and adoption of currency of other countries, and become a part of monetary union, to participate in the currency bloc. So this, after the downfall of the agreement, this was what IMF suggested. So basically, although it's not in existence in a way, it made a huge, obviously, effect in what has happened during our history. So because of that, we do have IMF, we have the World Bank, which does the lending funds to the growing and developing economies. Before we go any further, there's a picture of the representatives, the major representative Bretton Woods. While we're looking at that, you have to remember, I think, that affected many countries. What happened in the delinking really of gold and dollar, and the free float of exchanges. Now, it's beyond our scope now, but when you look at, for instance, UK, they had a very bad recession, 1973 to 1975, on top of everything else. And one of the culprits was actually the free float with the British pound, the sterling, and it did create a big unemployment, and it was a really bad environment. So there has been some bad feelings and bad memories from there. And of course, we had the oil embargo, we had the high inflation, and what happened with the OPEC creating the oil prices going to the roof. So, and we will discuss on the petrodollar what happened. So anyway, this is Bretton Woods. So let me just speak a little more about the Bretton Woods, how the agreement started. So here what you can see is, you know, there's the dollar, there's gold. Dollar is pegged to this gold, and all the other currencies are pegged to dollar. So the dollar is the currency, but still has a gold standard behind it. So basically, what that means is basically what happens. Remember, we had the World War II. This is happening after that. So worst currencies actually return to the new system at their pre-World War II rates. So what happened was, but after the war, these rates were kind of overvalued because of all that has happened. So the dollar artificially became undervalued. So because it was undervalued, the exports were more favorable, there were more exportation. And then after World War II, because of the expansion, then it became inflationary. Now, because of that, by the early 1950s, now because of the inflation, actually now it became more value, because of the valuation. Now the U.S. exportation went down. So I just want to give you a couple of examples. This is like, you can see how the German mark, the British pound, the French franc, they were all pegged to US dollar, and US dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. And this is a picture in 1955. You see the French franc was at 3.5, and Italian lira was 625, and so on. Japanese yen was 360 yen, 4.2 for Deutsche Mark. And all other countries had to choose, and they were obliged to do the rates pegged to these. So we discussed the 1973 actually events and the inflation. So some of you probably went around or very too young to remember, what happened with the oil problem. So what happened was President Nixon decided, because of what was happening, to use the dollar as the currency of choice. So he did go to Saudi Arabia and said, you know what, and all the Persian Gulf members, that were, I believe there was United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, for instance, Iraq, and basically they came together and they talked about using the dollar as a currency for all the petroleum and the oil. And that's how this petrodollar came into existence. So what happened was, that was, the early 1970s, actually it was 1973, and 1974 became official. And now you can see that the relationship between Saudi Arabia and United States, they're really watching each other's backs, so sometimes closing their eyes to whatever is happening because of the petrodollar. So it created demand for the US assets when the dollar received for oil. So remember, any exporting country has to use the dollar in order to, or the importing countries, they have to pay in dollar. So it basically was beneficial for the dollar because it promoted non-inflationary growth. So now the question is, if we move away from petrodollar, which has been talks, it been, it was kind of defeated. There was some countries in Asia, for instance, they wanted to use the euro, for instance, and now there's a talk. Some countries actually want to use gold, and now with the creation of these cryptocurrencies, is there going to be any alternative? So these are the thoughts we have. I mean, we are not there yet, and that's what it's, again, what is going to happen with the petrodollar and why Saudi Arabia has so much, for instance, control. So this hopefully clarifies that. Now, through bilateral agreement with Saudi Arabia in 1974, US managed to influence members of the OPEC to standardize the sale of the oil in dollars. Now, what happened was, in order to do that, Saudi Arabia and other Arab states see the US influence, like for instance in Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, because of that, we have a lot of military assistance in the Middle East, for instance. And obviously at that time, 1979, you had the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Iran had the fall of Shah and the, the revolution. And then you had Iran-Iraq war. So all of these are very much related to each other. And that's how the petrodollar was created. One thing I wanted after the 2008 financial crisis, a lot of European countries were affected, but there were few that even from 1970s, they were really more dependent on the major European economies. And then this term of PIGS, and PIGS basically stands for Portugal, for Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain. And then Greece was really the culprit. And then what happened was eventually that name changed from PIGS. They stopped using that. And this is a video that's how it initially started. But then they moved away, and I call it, as I said, I call it GIPS, which we use it in portfolio management. Now, there was, some of you might remember, I remember clearly, I was trading those days, and it was not fun. It created a lot of opportunity though, but it was a yo-yo. And basically, I remember the August of 2011, and basically what continued, the unemployment was unbelievable in a country like Greece. People are revolting, and you go to Portugal, and so you can see the amount of the public sector debt was unbelievable. I mean, when you look at Italy and you look at Greece at almost 115%, and then there's no really all the recessions around all these countries. So it was important. And the reason I want to share this with you is, again, basically there's a little explanation what happened in a sense, the printing money, and obviously the biggest responsibility came on the shoulders of Germany, being the most responsible economy in Europe. They were helping, ended up helping, for instance, Greece by issuing like plus in all the other countries 750 million euro, and they kept continuing with that. And there was a lot of questions, a lot of northern economies. They were saying why they should be responsible for the irresponsibility of these countries. But anyway, this looks like a very distant past, but the effects still linger. The reason I want to share this with you is the relationship between the dollar and gold and the currency. So here we have a financial crisis in 2011. So I will show you this. So basically, you can see the gold. Actually, it was the highest it had been. By then, it was came close to $1,926 actually. Not that, but eventually actually started going down. Although we still had the, basically we did still have the crisis. Now, in the times of crisis, granted, we do talk about, yes, we go to stability, the sanctuary of gold, because we want to make sure our currency is valued. But one of the reasons people misunderstood that, supply and demand is actually as important. So although people were going, in the case of crisis, we do go to gold. But all these central banks in Spain, Portugal especially, they had to pay the government employees. They had to provide for their social programs, and Greece the same thing, but more so in Spain and Portugal. So what happened, they started selling their gold reserves, because remember, when you're in a crisis, you don't go and say, what is happening with the comparable prices. You just want to get the liquidity so you can take care of whatever obligations you have. So even though there was a time of crisis, the central banks had to sell their reserves. So consequently, the price of gold actually went down in the time of turmoil. So I wanted to share that with you because nothing is in black and white. So you have to look at all the different aspects and all kind of different factors. So one thing I want to share with you, just because we talked about dollar, when we talk about US dollar index, basically because of the multiple currencies, not this is what the representation is. So when you see the dollars up or down, not on the major currencies or the cross currency, I'm just talking about the basket of currencies which created the US dollar index. And you can see euro is the largest, obviously, factor. And we've discussed this in our Forex and currency classes and webinars, so you can refer to that. I just want to show you another historical so you could see what the dollar has done in the almost past 40 years. And you can see the highs and lows at 130 being the dollar index. You could see 2009-10 we hit the lowest in the past 40 years. So what I want to do, I'm just adding extra bonus. This is coming from National Mining Association, and what they did, as I said, they've gone through the history of gold, and I thought you might enjoy this year by year, what has happened, the major things that influenced the price of gold, and basically it comes to all the way to 2002. All right. With that in mind, I hope it was helpful. Hopefully you have a little more clear picture of where we stand as far as the relationship between the gold and the dollar, and also, again, as I mentioned, the alternative currencies. So this way you can have again, hopefully better investment opportunities and understandings. So with that in mind, what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop recording, and then we can open up for questions.